Welcome all to the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at UC Berkeley, our speaker series, where we feature leading edge issues in politics, current events, and scientific breakthroughs in our understanding. I'm Susan Hoffman, OLLI Director and Assistant Dean for Lifelong Learning at UC Berkeley. Today, we have joining us Dan Kammen. Dan, as you know, has spoken with us several times and taught with us. He is energy, climate, policy professor extraordinaire, and I'm delighted that he can be with us one more time. This event will be recorded and captioned and made available to all of you who are registered. It will also be posted on YouTube. And so please feel free to share it with all your friends and colleagues. And so, Dan, over to you.
Well, Susan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back. As you'll see, it's going to feel a little peculiar because I'm going to be talking about something that I certainly think is critical to the climate, to the California story, but that sentiment is not shared. So hopefully this won't be kind of a discussion for posterity. But let me share some slides and kind of jump in. And I hope many of these features are going to become self-evident. And so what I'll be covering today is certainly what we at UC Berkeley feel is a total core component. It's one that we probably were too slow to embrace, but it is now a core component of thinking about climate issues in California and beyond. And I'll try to go back and forth between what feels like the normal dialogue for us and what has now become a totally abnormal dialogue in Washington, D.C. So, and I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, been here 25 years, and have homes in three different units, the Energy and Resources Group, Goldman School of Policy, and Department of Nuclear Engineering. And my own laboratory is called RAIL, the Renewable and Appropriate Energy Laboratory. And when the political climate is suitable, I've served in the Clinton, Obama, and then Biden administrations, and certainly thought there'd be an interesting chance to be playing a role in the Harris-Walz administration, which didn't quite come to be according to my thinking, and I'll try to get into that as we go. And so, again, the topic for today is going to be the just transition, environmental justice, injustice, and anyone who wants to access some of the, not just the academic papers, but the video clips, the dialogues, the bills we've worked on can go to the website of my laboratory, rail.berkeley.edu. And now that we no longer use the former little blue bird that became the black X. Now the place is Blue Sky, which looks exceedingly similar. For those of you on it, my Blue Sky address and that for my laboratory is just my name, Dan Kammen, bsky.social. And we try to post about once a day about things going on in the laboratory. And again, I'll come back to those in a little bit. So again, the topic for today is not climate change per se, although that will figure prominently. It's what are we thinking and what are we doing and what is the translation from research to real active engagement around the topic of environmental justice or environmental inequality. And the irony is not lost on me that essentially every federal office that has what we call DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, or JEDI, justice, equity, diversion, inclusivity, all of these terms are being expunged from the Federal Register. Offices of DEI are being closed. The office that I will come back to in about 10 minutes, a Biden-Harris administration creation that I thought was actually one of the biggest advances in understanding and addressing climate change, so-called Justice 40, which I'll explain in a bit, launched by President Biden on his first full day in office and closed by President Trump on his second day in office. And so it's hard to find a topic that's more partisan in this world than today. But just to kind of frame the conversation a little bit, the graph you're seeing here is the standard climate picture that climate scientists have been showing in various forms for decades. The black line at the left shows the rise in greenhouse gas emissions. The policies that are currently in place, when you add up US policy up until the end of the Biden administration, French policy, Nigerian policy, Vietnamese policy, Kenyan policy, Danish policy, all of those, when summed up, add up to this wide light blue band at the top. Current policies that would limit warming, would have roughly stopped warming where we are now, and slowly brought it down. And then the various lines, the orange line, the darker blue, the purple, are all different takes on those climate targets that in total are generally called the Paris Climate Accords, meaning a commitment to limit warming to initially 2 degrees Celsius and then 1.5 degrees Celsius of overall rise, recognizing that even if things had gone differently in the US election, we have more or less already given up any hope of the 1.5 degree pathway that, as you can see here, would require emissions to essentially start falling immediately, like yesterday, and fall so much that by mid-century, emissions would be zero, but we would continue to reduce, and I'll explain that in a second. How do you reduce from zero? So that we began to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, and that by the end of this current century, of which we have 74.8 years to go, would have gotten us back to the pre-industrial levels in the atmosphere by doing one of two things: shifting all of our energy production to clean energy and removing carbon from the atmosphere. And there's two broad ways to do that. One of them is to do it mechanically, so at power plants to suck the carbon dioxide underground. That is a pathway that many scientists are in favor of. I am not. Um, my view is that if we simply made nature healthier by investing in forests and preserving mangrove swamps and coastal kelp forests, et cetera, nature would actually absorb more carbon than it's doing now, and we would draw carbon out through so-called nature-based solutions, preserving the Amazon, preserving the Congo Basin, preserving Borneo, etc. This is an area where scientists disagree strongly, and it's something we're not going to get into in this talk, but these pathways are more or less the climate story that first was got a huge amount of attention with the Kyoto Protocol. That was the third of the climate meetings. And then the 15th meeting, the Copenhagen Protocol, and we're really encapsulated in COP21, the Paris Climate Agreement. And this coming December, we will have COP30 that will take place in Belém in Brazil. It'll be the first time the COP took place in a rainforest. But this framing of mitigating through clean energy and then maybe adapting to climate change is the story that, at least in terms of U.S. federal policy, with the election of Mr. Trump, has now ended, and it's an abrupt as possible ending. Um, the agencies involved have been told to not use words like climate change anymore. I am currently in Germany, where they look at us and shake their heads, and they say the first sign of totalitarian takeover is being censured in terms of the language you use, and the second sign of totalitarian takeover is people letting it happen. And Germans shake their head and say, we thought we learned something in the 30s here in Germany, and you seem to be reliving it in various ways. And so the warning signs are to them quite clear. We are still debating what to do. Um, but when we think about these climate standards, the goal going into the Paris meeting, COP21, was that we limit warming to 2 degrees, and the science community, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that shared the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize, a group I'm part of, looked at the data and said that is not sufficient. we should be aiming for 1.5 degrees. And if you just look here and look up and down the table, you'll more or less see that almost everything is twice as bad at 2 degrees than at 1.5 degrees, meaning each tenth of a degree really matters. And we are currently in a world where we've warmed the planet by somewhere between 1.3 and 1.4 degrees. So there's almost no room left to emit anymore. And yet the new administration in the US has said climate change doesn't exist and or we're not responsible. And so we are closing those offices and we are redirecting the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Program agency, to focus on what they're calling U.S. energy dominance, which means ramping up dramatically the export of fossil fuels. And this is not only a Trump thing. While President Biden did a number of things that were pro-climate, and I'll mention this one called Justice 40 in a second. The other big thing is that President Biden actually quietly presided over a quite dramatic increase in the U.S. exporting natural gas, or what I call fossil gas. So this is not only a Republican versus Democratic thing, and compared to many other countries, Germany, UK, that are really working hard to bring their emissions to zero, just as we're doing in California. The U.S. Administration is right now flip-flopped in that entirely. And I show these pictures on the right just to kind of highlight a clear May Day in New York City. And then only 2 days later, the middle image, when fires in Quebec dramatically changed New York air quality, something that we are used to in California, but they're not so used to. And just to put it in context with I think, a relatively good science fiction movie, the Blade Runner remake movie. And you can see in that movie the sky over Los Angeles or east of Los Angeles in a movie for 2049 is not even as bad as the air quality that we actually saw in New York City. So this story about climate change and the impacts is severe as is. And but what I want to highlight is the justice aspect of this story, meaning it's not just about do we find a way to transition to clean energy, but do we do so in a way where the impacts are felt in a way that are pro-equity, that they impact the most vulnerable, the least able to adjust in ways that essentially give back to the global poor, the poor in the Central Valley of California, poor across the US in terms of people who are living with substandard either cooling in, say, the Central Valley in the U.S. Southwest, or substandard heating in the Northeast. And the frame that many use for that on a global scale are called these SDGs, these Sustainable Development Goals. And United Nations adopted a series of 17 different goals. And they are goals to be achieved by 2030. The bad news is that we're behind schedule. The good news is that we at least have these goals. And so the one that gets most attention in the climate world is this SDG 7, and that's to recognize that there's about 800 million people on the planet that do not have access to electricity today, and that's defined as physically not having access or not having access to affordable or reliable electricity. And yes, most of those are in emerging economies, but a good number in the US where energy poverty and energy insecurity are real things in the Central Valley, where people use these old style swamp coolers because it's cheaper than air conditioning, and the great number of low income people across the US Northeast who have to make choices between food and heating in their homes. And so there are many goals. SDG 2 is about clean water. SDG 3 is about universal access to healthcare. There's a range of them, but the one that will kind of shape what I'm going to talk about today will be this one on universal energy access. And I'll highlight that for a couple reasons. On the one hand, the language climate justice is new. It's relatively synonymous with the Black Lives Matter movement, although there have been some scholars working on this going back decades. In fact, a member of President Biden's Justice 40 Commission wrote a famous book in the 1990s called Dumping in Dixie, all about environmental injustice in the US Southeast. That scholar, a sociologist, Bob Bullard, wrote that book while in residence at UC Berkeley. And what Bob Bullard likes to say is that he is not a sociologist of dead white people. He is a kick-ass sociologist studying racial inequality, lack of access to transportation in Houston, food deserts in parts of Los Angeles where poor people have to go a long distance to access the kind of healthier food that many people in the Bay Area may grumble about the prices, but have direct access to. So this graph is one of the compilation figures put together by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change to highlight that global greenhouse gas emissions are dominated by countries in the north, although right now the number one emitter of greenhouse gases is China. They passed us several years ago. But if you look at who is emitting not by country, but by income, what we find is the richest 1% of the population are responsible for about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. The richest 10% of the world are responsible for over half of our greenhouse gas emissions, and that includes most of us in this room. I don't want to speak for everyone, but by and large, if you get to attend this kind of seminar, myself included, we are on the high emitting end of the spectrum. I'm personally, unfortunately, a major emitter through my international travel. The poorest half of the planet are responsible for less than 7% of emissions. And this has profound implications for how we might think about the climate story. The way I tend to say it is that while we were slow to recognize the environmental injustice of our poorest, most exposed, most female aspects of our population are the most exposed to pollution. They live next to power plants. They have the least ability to move to less polluted areas because of the high cost of housing, particularly in California. And the language that I have preferred to use, and I'll highlight why in a second, is that I don't believe it's possible to solve the climate crisis if we don't directly think about equity and justice. And I don't think we can make serious progress on making our society more just, more inclusive, if we don't also solve climate. And so these are a coupled pair of issues. A good friend of mine, a environmental justice scholar at University of Southern California, used to be at UC Santa Cruz, Manuel Pastor likes to say that climate justice or environmental justice must be baked into our policies, environmental and non-environmental, not sprinkled on top. And to my mind, that's about the most succinct version of where we are. And those of you who drive through downtown Oakland will often see this large billboard in the California Endowment Building. And not all of this difference is due to climate, but it's just striking that if we do one number change in the zip code, I live in 94611 in Oakland, but 94621, there is a full 10-year difference in life expectancy. Not all of it due to climate, but climate is a part of that story in terms of toxics and pollution and ability to access both financially and logistically healthier foods, etc. And that is a damning statement, no matter what fraction of that story is due to the climate story in front of us. Now, I mentioned Justice 40 a few times, and when President Biden was Vice President Biden campaigning, he came out to California, met with members of Governor Newsom's team, met with a variety of environmental justice groups, and went back to the campaign trail and said, well, California has something which we didn't call, but he called Justice 35. And I'm going to do 5% better. I'm going to launch in my presidency, if I win, which he did, Justice 40. So why do I say California has Justice 35? When California passed its series of climate bills, one aspect of that was first Assembly Bill 32, that called for us to limit the growth in greenhouse gas emissions. And then Senate Bill 32, because the same member of the Assembly was then elected to the Senate, Fran Pavley, one of the heroes of the planet that I put on par with a Rachel Carson for the work that she did for California and the world. Um, but her Senate Bill 32, which led to California's cap and trade system, meaning the system to have a market-based mechanism, imperfect but workable, to require companies that didn't want to invest in low carbon solutions to pay to buy credits from companies that did have low carbon solutions, like switching to clean energy, and that those revenues would be used at the state level to invest in needed activities, electric vehicle charging stations in low income communities, efforts to retrofit buildings with heat pumps, a whole variety of different measures. And why I'm calling it Justice 35 is that the letter of the California law said that 35% or more, it was a floor and not a ceiling, but 35% of our cap and trade revenues must be spent on fence line communities, communities that have underattainment for air or water quality, communities that are predominantly minority, communities that are primarily women head of households. And that funding was locked in. And California was far from perfect, but it spent that money in some good ways on a variety of what we call EJ, environmental justice programs. Then Vice President Biden said, I'm going to go 5% better. And here you see an element of an executive order, and we've just seen Trump's flurry of executive orders. This is one of Biden's executive orders in 2021, where he said that we are going to develop a new metric, not the price of carbon, because of course the price of something and the value of something are not the same, but the price of carbon is going to be taken out of just the simple whatever the market will bear, and we will have a social cost of carbon to reflect the damage of greenhouse gas emissions to people, most exposed people, and to ecosystems. This had a complicated path through the courts, but by the end of the Biden administration, this had actually made it through. And so the so-called social cost of carbon, social cost of methane was the letter of the land. And of course, this is one of the things that Mr. Trump removed immediately. And so, again, a night and day difference between the administrations. When we think about these different metrics, and most of these metrics, these so-called sustainable development goals, most people think about it in terms of, oh, how are they doing on energy access or clean water in the biggest slum in Nairobi or in Manila? But in fact, these are also equally applicable to underserved US communities. And so again, we have 17 different metrics. Again, the one I tend to focus on most a bit myopically is SDG 7. But the bad news is that the goals to bring energy access to everyone on the planet by 2030, to have health care available to everyone in some form by 2030, to clean water, making it available to everyone by 2030. These are the SDGs, and the progress is poor. And here are all 17 of them. Again, SDG 7 is kind of my home turf. And what you can see is for a few of the metrics, and the reason why these are bars is that while there are 17 individual metrics, there are 169 submetrics. And so there's a different number for each area. For example, in SDG 7, it's universal access to clean electricity, but it also says clean and affordable cooking should be available to everyone. And that's a sub goal. And so that's why these are bars. And what you see here is that a small minority of those are green. The vast majority are yellow, where there's some progress, but we're not on goal. And there's a great deal of red, meaning we are not going to make these 2030 goals, just like we are not going to make those climate goals. And that's even before Mr. Trump came in. So we have a story that maybe we could just say it's very depressing, but I'm going to try to highlight going forward in this talk some of the things that actually give me hope that we have at least a global community that cares. It's not clear that Washington, D.C. cares right now. In fact, I would say they don't. But so just thinking about some of these stories where one of them that's come out of California is illustrated here in this somewhat confusing looking curve, but I hope as I explain it, it will actually get much clearer. And what you see is the demand for electricity over a 24-hour period in California. Now, the day that's been chosen here is in the spring, and the spring is our best season. But let me just walk you through this. So, what you see here, if you start on the far left, that's midnight, and the far right is midnight. And what happens during the day is the story of California's shifting energy demand. First, look at the top line, that light line for 2015 that runs across the top. You can see that back then, a decade ago, the energy demand of 20 gigawatts, that's 20,000 megawatts, or that is 20 big power plants worth, whether they're coal, oil, or nuclear, or hydro, or solar. But you can see the demand was pretty flat in the middle of the night, pretty flat during the day, and it then peaked in the evening. And that's because when people come home from work, they turn things on, but businesses are still on. So we have an evening peak of demand. As California has become a global leader in installing renewables, including much of the solar that's on the rooftops of my home and many of your homes, I certainly hope and expect. And you can see that that daytime flat curve got hollowed out until in 2023, our net demand went negative in the middle of the day. You can see it right here in the middle of the graph, 12 to 3 p.m. That's below zero. And what that means is that with all of our renewable energy, we were in a situation where we no longer imported power. And in fact, for the last 100 days, California has exported clean energy for a few minutes or a few hours every single day. And we are the world's fourth largest economy. So that is an amazing transition. That's one that tells a physical scientist like myself that we are installing clean energy. We're doing some great things. And it's one that also, interestingly enough, puts some real fear into the hearts of many utility executives and many economists. And why is that? Because while to me this is a success, what this says to my economist friends is that as we install more and more clean energy, the demand goes from a positive demand to a negative demand where we're exporting, which means that the marginal price of that energy goes down and down. And because we have not yet fully cleaned our economy, that means that the economic incentive to install more clean energy goes away. So this is where my economist friends and I have kind of a good-hearted debate. I say this is wonderful news. They say it's horrible news, and we argue back and forth. But I would argue what has now emerged, I don't want to say has proven me right, because you can never tell a colleague that they're wrong and you're right. You just kind of argue about it. But what I would say, what this means is that we now have ample clean energy so that if you want to charge up your electric vehicle or charge up a battery that supplies power to the grid, you should do it when the middle of the day happens and there's an excess of solar. And in fact, many of us drive to work or drive to a recreational center, plug our car in and charge up if we don't have a home charger, and take advantage of this low cost clean energy and provide a demand for it. And what this does is cleans the air. This is good for you, the driver of an electric vehicle. It's particularly good for someone who is a low income, marginalized person because most of our dirty industry and dirty power plants are coincidentally near where poor people live. We can get into the chicken or the egg in terms of which came first. But this cleans the air and is a social good. And so in California, we now are able to charge our vehicles not in the middle of the night. That's what many experts thought would be the logical way to do it a decade ago. But now, when those charging stations are available, go and charge up. And the more you do in the middle of the day, the better. And this has led to a huge boost in access to charging for electric vehicles. California has met and exceeded its standard. We now have close to 2 million electric vehicles in use. That's very small compared to the global leader of China that has about 28 million electric vehicles. But we're 40 million Californians, and they're about 1.3 billion people. So we are doing pretty well. Norway last month set a new record. There were 37 gas-powered cars sold in the whole country last month in Norway. So Norway is now over 90% of all new car sales are electric. Norway's electricity at home is clean. It's almost all hydropower. Of course, Norway makes a huge amount of money selling oil and gas, so there is a significant hypocrisy built in. But at home, they're very clean. It's just not clear their overseas footprint is that clean. Nor is ours, because the United States is now the world's largest exporter of oil and gas, eclipsing Saudi Arabia, and something that is very much part of the current administration's push forward. So electric vehicles are increasingly affordable, and now electric vehicles, there are pushes to say that each EV should not only be able to charge up from the grid, but should be able to sell power back. Tesla cannot do that. The Ford Lightning can do that. There's some bills being worked on to say we should have no more EV sales unless they have this literally $14 part so that they can both receive power and sell power back because the battery pack in an electric vehicle is quite large. Um, that battery pack could power several homes. And so this is an interesting change. Another feature of this change is that when we have this lower cost clean energy, we could make hydrogen. Hydrogen is controversial. Some people think it will be the next big thing that will replace electric vehicles. I am not someone who shares that view, but I do think there's uses for hydrogen in industry and in railways. And one reason is if your hydrogen is made with clean electricity, when you use it, when you combust it, there is no carbon dioxide released. What you release is oxygen, water vapor, and energy. And so currently we get most of our hydrogen from methane, from natural gas. That is not clean. But if we were to get that hydrogen from using renewables to split water, that is clean. And so the hydrogen from fossil fuels is called gray hydrogen. The hydrogen that we would do the same way, but we bury the CO2 by grabbing it out of the air, that's called blue hydrogen. In my view, also something I don't support, but others do. And then green hydrogen is if we use this clean electricity to make it. And so these are all parts of the story. And California has done a pretty remarkable job in not only ramping up solar, as I mentioned. Here's a New York Times article from 2024 highlighting the great deal of solar we have. This is the same picture during the day. You can see all that solar. And if you look really closely, you can see a little red snake, a little orange snake on the right-hand side. That's the amount of energy storage we had installed back in 2021. And now, if you look over here in 2024, you can see these big orange wings, meaning we are installing a great deal of storage so that we can utilize that solar or wind power or geothermal not only when it's being produced, but broader during the day. That is both an environmental win, and for the reasons I highlighted, it's also a justice win as we kind of think about the environmental impacts. And what's happening in California is making some pretty interesting inroads. This is a graph where I admit I have chosen the time of day very strategically. 5 p.m. Eastern Time in the spring is when California has really good solar and really good wind. So I have cherry picked, if you will, the time of day. The sun is up, and what you can see is across much of the US West, the price of electricity goes negative during that time because of the role of renewables, and it goes to zero in Texas, an oil and gas leader to be sure, but now after California, the second largest host of batteries, and by far the country's leader in terms of wind power. And then across the Northeast, more higher density of demand, you can see there is still a positive price for electricity. But this is a sign of a revolution going on, and one that is going to be stalled, if not set back dramatically in the new administration. But it was a real sign of environmental justice progress up until, again, November, sorry, January 2025. There are a lot of different aspects of the environmental justice story, and in the now the remaining 15 minutes of the talk, I will try to illustrate some of those. Just illustrating some of the many different aspects. Here's a New York Times piece I wrote with California State Senator Scott Wiener, highlighting the degree to which our high housing costs, meaning that the lower income you are, the more you must essentially drive or commute to be able to afford housing. We all know of stories of people living further east than Tracy to get affordable housing and commuting into the Bay Area each day because of jobs, which means that, of course, the least able to afford childcare have to miss the early morning and afternoons with their kids because of the high cost of housing, and also, of course, the high cost to all of us in terms of transportation, greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles, lack of affordable EVs for low-income drivers, and essentially the drive till you qualify society, which we have inadvertently put ourselves in. This other article from 2020 from the San Francisco Chronicle highlights some work that a number of people from my department at Berkeley, in particular, the chief sustainability officer for Lyft, did to work with the ride-sharing companies for all of their challenges to make it so that they would convert their fleets. And of course, the irony is that they insist they don't employ the drivers, so they don't really have fleets, and we'll leave that for a different conversation. But to work with their drivers so that all of their vehicles by 2030 would be clean vehicles, electric vehicles. And that has had some interesting features. There's been some work with the Newsom administration to make EVs available for purchase or lease at or below cost. So there are some interesting areas where this clean energy transition and justice have a direct back and forth with each other. And if we look at the climate damage story that we are seeing, and certainly are taken seriously in California, New York, Washington, Massachusetts, and New Mexico, a variety of states, but certainly now not being acknowledged by the federal government. This is just a picture of the billion-dollar climate crises and disasters that we have seen just in 2024 alone. And we know the story well in California with the fires, heat waves, but this is a story which is spreading elsewhere. And in fact, we saw Mr. Trump go to North Carolina and discuss the dismantling of FEMA, blaming the bad behavior on President Biden, et cetera. So this story is in the news, even if the acknowledgement of the climate side is not currently part of the federal story. Now, the other part of this story is one where, again, a number of groups at Stanford, Berkeley, UMass Amherst, MIT, number of universities have really been active in trying to quantify and understand where our environmental injustices are. And so I'll tell here a story before I conclude about one version of this. And this is a collaboration between two former research scholars in my laboratory. Deborah Sunter is now a professor of environmental justice at Tufts. Sergio Castellanos is a professor of environmental justice at the University of Texas. When they were in my laboratory, we did this work back in 2019. And as you'll see at the end, it had a direct role in launching this federal effort, Justice 40, very much still alive in California. And as I've been saying over and over again, very much not alive at the federal level. So what we did was to ask a very basic question, one that I had thought would just really be going to a website to look up the data, but turned out to be a little more involved. And that was, who has solar in the United States and how have we done? And so I thought we would just go to each state's record and look up how many homes have solar, but it turns out those records are not available. What is available is a project run by Google called Project Sunroof, where they have taken images of every rooftop in the United States. And yes, there's a creepy AI machine learning aspect to that story. Um, they did it ostensibly to determine which buildings would be prime locations for solar. You can invent your other reasons why they might have done it, but that was the formal reason, and the project is called Project Sunroof. So we use that data, and we use data from the census and the Internal Revenue Service. I understand they just received 1,000 staff person cut today. Um, and so we use that data to look at who has solar, what is their income, and what is their race and ethnicity. I'm going to skip the graph on the left for a second. We'll come back to that perhaps at the very end. But this paper, in what we did was then to divide up the country not into just zip codes, but we went down all the way to the census tract, and that is the much smaller unit. And you've seen the census tract data when you pay your property taxes. And so what we looked at was who has solar and who doesn't as a function of, again, income and race. What we found is that at this small granular level, if your community, your census tract is majority white, 51% or more white, you are 30 to 50% more likely to have solar on your roof. If you are in a Hispanic majority, 51% or more Hispanic, you are 30 to 50% less likely to have solar than a undifferentiated community. And if you're an African American community, you are between 35 and 69% less likely to have solar than a undifferentiated, a community that did not have any particular racial majority. And we found that to be true from homes below the poverty line, $26,000 a year, an embarrassment for other reasons, up to $250,000 income per household. Let me say that again. Across a full order magnitude of household income, white families from poor, below the poverty line to rich, more likely to have solar, Hispanic across that full range, less likely, and African American, even less likely. And this is not one where we see it only for rich households. We see this from poor to rich all the way across. This report got a fair amount of attention, and it was one of the studies that, um, once elected, President Biden used to help establish this Justice 40 effort, um, and launched this as an effort run by the Department of Energy, but coordinating across many government agencies. And this was one of the first things that was closed when Mr. Trump came into power. And again, it's an example of doing the analysis to understand who has solar and who doesn't, to try to answer the question, is solar just for the rich? One might like to think it's not the case. What we found was something quite different than that. And I think the broader story is that what we found shouldn't surprise anybody. It did surprise me. My naivete really was showing. I thought we would see a difference at high income, but not so much at low income because of some of the many Head Start and jobs programs for the low income. But that was, in fact, not the case. Um, it doesn't mean we can't do things differently. What it means is that if we don't take advantage and think hard about what are our social mechanisms. We know there is still redlining against minorities in the United States. We know that insurance policies are more difficult to get as a function of being brown skinned versus white skinned. So we know there are systemic biases that exist in our society. In California, we recognize those. We have a world leading dashboard and set of metrics, and these are some of the metrics being dismantled by the current administration. Again, we did this work by using the satellite data, by doing some AI, by identifying solar, by identifying who has it. And then again, I'm just showing the data, but no need to dig into the story. More than I've said, again, it's from a whole order of magnitude of income. We see this dramatic change. I'm going to skip to a last bit so we have time for questions. And I just want to highlight one last project opportunity. And this is called the Eco Block, and this is a project that we started many years ago. It is in the Fruitvale section of Oakland. And this is a project funded by the state of California, the California Energy Commission, but with partners across a number of groups at UC Berkeley and a wide range of energy installers, a community association developed in this community. And the idea of the Eco Block is not only to share solar on rooftops. After all, if you own your home, installing solar isn't that difficult. But if you're a renter, it's very difficult. This is a program to try to work cooperatively between owners and renters. And the idea of this program is that each home would have solar installed on the roof, but not owned by the homeowner, owned by the community association. The community went through a year-long process to decide how each home should be apportioned energy from this collective but distributed grid. Should each home get an equal amount? Should it be based on the number of people? Should it be based on the size of the home, the prior electric bill? They came up with a solution. They actually decided to distribute the energy proportional to the number of people in each household, not the size of the home. That was not a unanimous decision. But what is now existing, it's actually in the final stages of construction now off of Fruitvale Avenue, is this 40 dwelling, two block area. There are two apartment buildings, there are some standalone homes, there are some so-called mother-in-law units or converted garages, and they share the collected solar in batteries that are distributed around the block. Each home gets a certain share. They can choose to buy more or they can choose to save. And the excess energy is sold to PG&E through an arrangement, and the community then gets back and shares the proceeds from that process. They have also now decided that what they'd like to do is devote some of that energy to have EV chargers that are not in people's driveways, that are on the street, like you see in Paris and some US cities, um, and to have zip cars or shared electric vehicles on the block that the block will have access to. And so there's an effort to procure those. This is a pilot, but I highlight it at the end of this talk because it's an example of thinking about ways in a neighborhood to make core to their decision making the process of thinking through equity and justice issues. Sharing the screen. I admit I've not been tracking the texts as I see, and so thanks, Susan, for highlighting it. And so for our last 12 minutes, please either just jump in and ask a question or put it in the text, um, and we'll kind of go from there and talk about what your interests are. So fire away. And I'll start with Paula's question. If our net demand is negative during the day, are we unable to store that power for the non-daylight times? Great question. And I tried to show in that New York Times graph that only 3 years ago there wasn't much storage capacity in California. Now, when you install rooftop solar, there is no longer a subsidy for installing solar, but if you install storage and solar, you can get money back. You could initially get money back from the Inflation Reduction Act and from the state. Inflation Reduction Act is going away under the current president. There are still some state programs, and the more of that energy storage we install, the more we can use that at off-peak times, whether it's later in the day or at night. And as I mentioned before, California has been able to send that power to our neighboring states, to send that green energy. And so we are seeing some positive signs as California and now New York and in particular Texas become real global leaders in not only clean energy installations, but also energy storage.
And then, Dan, we've got Rick's question where he thought that with the question to you is how much, if any, of the commitments, policy initiatives, and money identified in the legislation Biden signed, which we thought were hardwired, have been protected from Trump's attack, what's happened, and what will happen?
Well, we don't know. That's a great question. Rick is on the money in terms of this. About 77% of the Inflation Reduction Act money were in fact already sent out. That doesn't mean there aren't some mechanisms to recall it, and there is an effort led by Elon Musk and Doggy Doge,
Yeah.
um, to pull some, find out what's successful there. But what we do know for sure is that the roughly 20% that was unspent at the end of the Biden
Mhm.
administration has been halted by the new, unless one of these lawsuits, 20% of the 300. So yes, there's been some definite pullback of funds.
Dan, we are experiencing some breakup of you there in Berlin. And so you said that,
Ah, okay. So that must be something at my end here in Germany.
okay. Do you want to
Yeah,
say what?
my apologies. I'm not sure why the signal is bad.
Okay. So in
Yeah,
so
no, I do apologize. I'm not sure what the issue is.
yeah, that's okay. So that there are some of their orders are being held up in the courts. Is that what you said?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes,
You
that's
said
right. About 20% of the money looks like it will not make it out because it has been held up. And unless again one of these legal decisions frees it up, it will not make it out the door. So it looks like about 20% of the 369 billion won't make it out.
the next question from Richard Otter is, I'm not
Yep.
clear why putting solar panels on a home is a justice issue. I'd much rather have it either centralized than have to deal with it. It seems more of a burden than a privilege.
Well, so having solar is certainly a privilege in the sense that for much of the run up to now, up to 2021, installing solar was an option largely for the affluent. And the first big wave of solar in California went to the rich. The justice benefit is that the more distributed clean energy, the cleaner our air has been, and there's been some dramatic studies. A colleague of mine at Berkeley, Ron Cohen, did a study and found that because of electric vehicles and because of distributed solar, the air in the Bay Area is 3 to 5% cleaner than it would have been. So that is a benefit to us all. But of course, many of these subsidies and other benefits went to those affluent homeowners who installed it. And so certainly there is an there is a privilege as well as a benefit aspect to that story. The other part of Richard's question is he'd rather see large centralized solar and wind farms. And California is also a leader in those. I didn't mean to say we don't have those. In fact, we are the national leader in large scale solar. Texas is this national leader in large scale wind, and we also trail Iowa and several other states in terms of wind. But in terms of solar and in terms of geothermal, we are very much the leader overall. And what it's meant is that we have been able to make some significant inroads on air quality issues as a result of that distributed solar. Arthur asks, is there a role for nuclear energy? And this is definitely a talk unto itself. Um, I'm going to, even though I'm a professor of nuclear engineering, I'm going to do a little bit of an end run around this question because it would take all our remaining time. But just to say that as of today, building new nuclear in California remains illegal. Under Governor Brown, the state passed a requirement that we do not build any new nuclear. Our one single remaining nuclear plant, Diablo Canyon, was given a life extension to 2030. So we will have one plant remaining. It is the single largest low carbon facility in the state. It is not clear, and there is considerable debate between the two different sides on this, whether that could be easily replaced by clean energy. And you saw on the graph, it looks like we have some extra even as of today, and by 2030, quite a bit more. Or if the so-called baseload and secure aspect of nuclear, meaning it can be on at 4 a.m. just as well as 4 p.m., doesn't make it a unique resource that should be built into the equation. California and Germany, two places that have arguably gone the furthest to clean energy, have both, for their own reasons, decided to exclude nuclear. Obviously, France has not. Japan has wavered back and forth. Are they going to rebuild nuclear or not? China, New York State, many others. And the federal perspective under both President Biden and President Trump is pro-nuclear. So certainly in terms of a national or a global perspective, there is certainly a role for nuclear. Right now, the biggest thing in nuclear, or maybe the smallest thing in nuclear, is an effort to build a new type of nuclear power plant called small modular reactors. They are 1/10 to 1/3 the size of a standard nuclear plant. And there are supposed to be some economic benefits of doing that. However, the first two small modular reactors that were scheduled to be built were both canceled by the community due to rising costs. Although in the last 2 months, both Amazon and Google have put in multi-billion-dollar orders for these small plants. So I'm going to leave it there. This is a complicated story, and I am
Mm.
only talking at this point about uranium and some thorium-based plants, so-called traditional fission reactors, not the fusion plant, not the fusion process that we saw take its first successful terrestrial operation at Lawrence Livermore happened 2.5 years ago.
Uh, Dan, thank you for answering that question, beginning to answer that question. I have the earlier you mentioned that cap and trade, that California has offered. Has that worked? Has it can what has it worked overall to
Yep.
bring in companies to
That's a great
clean?
question. So it has worked in the sense that our cap and trade system is robust. It works. Our carbon price is relatively low, and that's a good sign. But what is in debate is cap and trade an ideal way to do things? The
Right.
Pope has come out against cap and trade, and he said cap and trade is essentially a way for rich companies to buy off their responsibility in the market. And so there is a debate. California's cap and trade system is has been a mechanistic success. Whether it's been the biggest part of our carbon reduction is something that groups will debate. Some people say, oh no, it's our sectoral policies, our solar roof, our electric vehicle policies. Others will say, no, no, those policies have worked well because we have this cap and trade as a backstop. And right now, the two best working versions are the cap and trade system in California and that in Europe called the ETS, the emissions trading scheme.
Okay. In thinking about California's leadership and also thinking about the current administration, can you give us the top two or three things to watch out for as citizens? What can we do to maintain California's leadership? And you've done a good job of exporting faculty to Texas and New York and New Jersey, other places. Thank you very much. So that there are trained climate scientists in these other states. But what else might we do as citizens, like as we read the paper and think about our own actions?
Well, the biggest thing to watch for, of course, are these dramatic cuts. And while U.S. aid was the first under the knife, And now Department of Education, IRS, EPA are all next. One of the real challenges is the loss of expertise. These are technically challenging areas. You have to be pretty expert to work on them. California provided quite a large number of those experts, as you highlighted. But I think one of the key things, and there is a California task force working with the other states that are leaders in different aspects of clean energy, New Mexico, Washington State, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Texas, is really to keep those partnerships and those activities going. Um, some people call that rule from below. It's not quite clear that's what's happening right now, but it is certainly that expertise is something that you don't rebuild quickly. We need it to go on in places like the states I just mentioned, but certainly one of the big aspects is to build and sustain partnerships at the subnational level while we watch this at least for me, a fairly horrific process going on. And I know we're right at time. I'll just put a link in here to address Margaret's question. I was an employee at USAID. I was the senior advisor for energy and innovation, and I just did a 5 long Q&A back and forth about it, and it's published on the website of the Goldman School of Policy, and I just put the link in the chat.
Great. Dan, thank you very much. This has been really helpful to have you back with us again. And, let me give appreciation for you reminding us of those sustainability development goals that the UN passed. I think we need to take a look at those 17 UN goals again and ask ourselves what we can do. And I think the slides overall, I think will hopefully be a part of keeping us
Absolutely.
on
Yep.
civic engagement level. So thank you for the link as well, which is in the chat. Let me
Yep.
mention to all of you who are here that next week in our speaker series, we have Jeff Ruck, who has represented government whistleblowers and scientists for decades. Hopefully you'll meet him, Dan, if you have not met. He's
Love to. Yeah.
was based in Washington, D.C. He's now living in the Bay Area. But he'll be here. The title of his talk is The Impunity of Official Disinformation, and he will review laws related to government transparency, scientific integrity, whistleblowing, and discuss them during this return of Trump. So I hope you will join us at the same time. And Dan, as always, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Great questions. Really appreciate it, everyone. Thank you so much.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.